In the summer of 2021, ships waited for days outside the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Their decks stacked with containers that carried everything from televisions to medical gloves. At the same time, in parts of Africa and South America, exporters stood beside warehouses filled with goods they could not ship because there were no containers available. Around the world, hundreds of thousands of containers sat idle in the wrong places. To understand how this happened, it helps to begin with the container itself. Before the 1950s, global trade was slow, expensive, and unpredictable. Goods were loaded and unloaded piece by piece, a process known as breakbulk shipping. That changed in 1956 when an American trucking entrepreneur named McLean launched the first container ship. His idea was simple: standardize the box. By creating uniform containers, eventually standardized as 20-foot and 40-foot units, cargo could move seamlessly from truck to ship to train without being repacked. Over the next decades, containerization transformed the global economy. Shipping costs fell by more than 90% for many goods, ports expanded, and global supply chains stretched across continents. By the early 21st century, container shipping had become the backbone of globalization. More than 90% of world trade by volume traveled by sea, and much of it moved inside these standardized steel boxes. At any given time, tens of millions of containers circulate globally. In theory, the system is a continuous loop. Containers carry goods from manufacturing hubs to consumer markets, are unloaded, refilled with exports, and sent back again. When this loop works smoothly, trade flows almost invisibly. But the system depends on balance. Containers accumulate where goods are imported in large quantities and thin out where exports dominate. For decades, trade imbalances have shaped container flows. The United States and Europe import far more manufactured goods than they export, while countries like China, Vietnam, and South Korea ship out more than they bring in. As a result, empty containers often pile up in Western ports. Shipping companies routinely reposition them back to Asia, sometimes at significant cost, because the next wave of exports depends on their return. This imbalance became a structural feature of global trade. In 2019, before the pandemic, China alone accounted for nearly 30% of global manufacturing output. The United States, meanwhile, ran a goods trade deficit of hundreds of billions of dollars. Containers carrying electronics, furniture, clothing, and machinery arrived in American ports and were often sent back empty because there were not enough exports to fill them. The cost of repositioning these empty containers was simply absorbed into the broader economics of shipping. Then came 2020. When the COVID-19 pandemic spread across continents, governments imposed lockdowns, factories closed, and consumer demand collapsed in many sectors. Shipping lines, expecting a prolonged downturn, cancelled sailings and reduced capacity. For this specific period, global trade contracted sharply. Containers stopped moving in their usual rhythm. Some were stranded at closed factories. Others were held at ports facing labor shortages and health restrictions. But the downturn was short-lived. By the second half of 2020, demand in advanced economies rebounded with unexpected strength. Consumers, unable to spend on travel or services, shifted toward physical goods. Home offices, exercise equipment, electronics, and furniture were suddenly in high demand. In the United States, retail sales of goods surged well above pre-pandemic trends. Imports from Asia accelerated rapidly, especially from China. The result was a surge in containerized trade that the system was not prepared to handle. Ports in California experienced record volumes. At one point in early 2022, more than 100 ships were anchored offshore, waiting for berths. Containers were unloaded but not cleared quickly, as trucking capacity and warehouse space were stretched thin. Many empty containers remained stacked in port yards because there was no space or labor to move them efficiently. Meanwhile, exporters of agricultural products in the American Midwest reported difficulty securing containers, as shipping lines prioritized returning empties to Asia as quickly as possible. This is the heart of the paradox. The world was not short of containers in absolute terms. In fact, production of new containers surged. In 2021 alone, Chinese manufacturers produced over 7 million 20-foot equivalent units, more than double the typical annual output. Yet containers were often in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were stuck in congested ports, delayed on ships waiting offshore, or trapped inland where transport networks were strained. During the height of the crisis, freight rates from Shanghai to Los Angeles rose from around $1,500 per 40-foot container before the pandemic to more than $10,000 at their peak. Faced with such rates, companies rushed empty containers back to Asia rather than allowing them to sit idle in other regions. The consequences rippled outward. Small exporters in developing countries struggled to access containers, which constrained their ability to participate in global trade. Farmers in parts of Africa and Latin America reported missed shipments and financial losses. At the same time, consumers in importing countries faced higher prices as elevated freight costs were passed along the supply chain. Inflation in goods, from appliances to bicycles, was partially driven by these logistics disruptions. The container imbalance also revealed the fragility of just-in-time supply chains. For decades, efficiency had been the guiding principle. Companies minimized inventory, relying on predictable shipping schedules and low transport costs. When containers were delayed or misplaced, factories ran short of components. The global semiconductor shortage, for example, was intensified by logistical bottlenecks that slowed the movement of key inputs. The problem was not simply production capacity, it was coordination across an interconnected system beyond the immediate economic effects. The episode raised broader questions about globalization. Container shipping had long been treated as a stable and almost invisible infrastructure. The sight of empty containers stacked high in ports, while businesses elsewhere pleaded for them, made visible the hidden architecture of global trade. It demonstrated how a health crisis could disrupt flows that had been optimized for decades, and how quickly imbalances could compound when shocks occur simultaneously across regions. By 2023 and 2024, freight rates began to normalize as demand cooled and port congestion eased. Shipping companies have invested in digital tracking systems to better manage container positioning. Some governments and firms have reconsidered supply chain strategies, including diversifying sourcing or increasing strategic inventories. Container production, which surged during the crisis, has since adjusted to lower demand, reflecting a cyclical industry that responds sharply to global events. Still, the underlying structure of trade imbalances persists. As long as some regions consume more than they produce and others produce more than they consume, containers will accumulate unevenly. The system relies on constant repositioning, careful coordination, and stable demand patterns. When those conditions are disrupted, the imbalance becomes visible in stacks of containers waiting without cargo. In the end, the story of empty containers is not simply about logistics. It is about how deeply interconnected the modern world has become. A shift in consumer behavior in one country can alter shipping patterns across oceans. A virus outbreak can change the economics of freight rates. A delay at a single port can echo through factories and farms thousands of miles away. The containers themselves are silent and uniform, identical in shape and color. Yet inside them flows the material expression of globalization, goods that sustain industries, households, and livelihoods. When they move smoothly, the system feels seamless. When they stall or accumulate in the wrong places, the imbalance becomes a signal that something deeper has shifted. The world is full of empty containers not because trade has stopped, but because it has become uneven, concentrated, and occasionally fragile. These containers tell a story of efficiency and vulnerability at the same time. They remind us that global prosperity depends not only on production and consumption, but on the often overlooked infrastructure that connects them. And in that infrastructure, balance is everything. If you like this video, like, subscribe and hit the notification for the next videos.